Hi everyone, it's Gene Calderon here again with Gene Calderon Apologetics Ministries. Continuing on in our Bible study. If you've been following the playlist that we have for Bible study, we're starting back in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures, and we're looking at the time past the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, the law. This is the first generation that actually has it, and we're in the book of Joshua. We're going to be looking at Joshua chapter 5, and our hope is to go through the entire Old Testament in chronological order, jumping from book to book back and forth, which doesn't necessarily mean we'll complete one full book and into another book. Sometimes the chapters are interlinked, and we'll have to jump from one book into another, maybe pause at one section in order to continue in another section and then come back to it. But that's not going to happen for a few books now. Right now, we're in the book of Joshua. It is going to be a continuation all the way through the entire book. So if you're with us, go ahead and follow us there. We are in chapter 5. If you haven't read the first 4 chapters, go ahead and read those and maybe even look at some of the previous videos we've posted. But we're going to start in chapter 5. And in chapter 5, we're going to see that because Israel was obedient to the Lord, the entire land of Canaan, they should have understood that that land that they were coming to and about to possess was already theirs. And God, in his mysterious ways, had already established in the minds of the Canaanites and the Amorites who were living there that it was just a matter of time before they themselves would be defeated and removed by God's army. And so the current residents there in the land of Canaan, they fell into this deep depression, and we'll see some of the results of that. And we should remember that as we read these accounts, all of the laws and the commands and the principles that were established in the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the principles in there are going to be shown in all of the action and all of the things that are going on in these accounts. It's not just historical. We see a lot of spiritual principles being fulfilled. So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and open up to Joshua chapter 5. I will be reading out of the NIV, the New International Version. If you have a different translation, that's fine. You can read through it. We'll look at any discrepancies amongst any words or translations if they come up. But for the most part, we should all be reading the same thing, just maybe worded a little bit different. So starting in Joshua chapter 5 at verse 1, I will begin to read. Now, when all of the Amorites west of the Jordan and all the Canaanite kings along the coast heard how the Lord had dried up the Jordan before the Israelites until they had crossed over, their hearts melted in fear, and they no longer had the courage to face the Israelites. At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, "Make flint knives and circumcise the Israelites again." So Joshua made flint knives and circumcised the Israelites at Gibeath Haraloth. Now, this is why they did so. All those who came out of Egypt, all the men of military age, died in the wilderness on the way after leaving Egypt. All the people that came out had been circumcised, but all the people born in the wilderness during the journey from Egypt had not. The Israelites had moved about the wilderness 40 years until all the men who were of military age when they had left Egypt had died, since they had not obeyed the Lord. For the Lord had sworn to them that they would not see the land he had solemnly promised their ancestors to give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. So he raised up their sons in their place, and these were the ones that Joshua circumcised. They were still uncircumcised because they had not been circumcised on the way. And after the whole nation had been circumcised, they remained where they were in camp until they were healed. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." So the place has been called Gilgal to this day. On the evening of the 14th day of the month, while camped at Gilgal on the plains of Jericho, the Israelites celebrated the Passover. The day after the Passover, that very day they ate some of the produce of the land, unleavened bread and roasted grain. The manna stopped the day after. They ate this food from the land. There was no longer any manna for the Israelites, but that year they ate the produce of Canaan. Now when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" "Neither," he replied, "but as commander of the army of the Lord I have now come." Then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, "What message does my Lord have for his servant?" The commander of the Lord's army replied, "Take off your sandals, for the place you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. All right, so now let's put this all together. We're going to go over the chapter. We'll go back to the beginning of the chapter and kind of walk our way through this with some of the commentary. So God goes out of his way to show that Joshua's divinely appointed authority over Israel. And we should remember that Moses, before Joshua, was God's mediator. And the only other mediator we know of in the Bible would be Jesus himself. And so there are only two mediators between man and God like this, as far as we know from Scripture. They are the only two who will exist. And what distinguishes Jesus and Moses from all other men being given the title mediator is that they were the ones that were appointed to hand down God's laws and commands to humanity. No one else spoke to God face to face, and no one else established God's heavenly laws on earth like Moses or like Jesus. Even the great prophets that would come afterwards, like Samuel or Isaiah or Zechariah or Daniel, they did not bring any new laws or commands, and they did not reject or dismiss any of the previous laws. They presented God's plans and instructions for Israel to be able to follow, with reminders of what would happen to Israel if they were disobedient to those laws. And so it's important for us to remember that no new laws should be added, and no previous laws should be omitted from the scriptures and from how we live our lives. The only two people who could do that would be Moses and Jesus. In fact, even angels or other divine spirits were not given the authority to come and modify the law in any way. So if we're ever reading the Old Testament or the Hebrew scriptures, and we read a passage and it seems like something might have changed, well, by definition, that's impossible, because God established his laws only through two people, Moses and Jesus. If they are not there to be able to do that, it cannot happen. So whatever happens after the book of Deuteronomy cannot and does not involve any fundamental change to the law, to the Torah. Now, there are some other denominations or Christian branches or other branches that follow the Bible that seem to be able to claim the right that they can change things, add things, take things away when it comes to God's laws or commands. We reject that. There is no other authority on heaven or on earth that can be able to do that in this time. Scripture never gives anybody the authority to be able to do that. And so that's something we need to be very careful of. Even in our New Testament, some people would say that the writings of Paul can be interpreted in a way that some of the laws have changed. And that is not at all what Paul's intention was. That never was something he communicated. And on top of that, we can be sure that Paul cannot do this because he is not one of those mediators that we know about like Moses or Jesus. So even if we think that that's what Paul is doing, we must understand that Paul cannot do those things. Maybe we're reading things a little bit inaccurately when it comes to those things. We need to be able to double check that, or have somebody who can teach us and share with us exactly what it is, the message that is being put out there by his writings. So what we're going to see is Joshua leading the people based on understanding the law of Moses that was chiseled in stone and cannot be changed or tampered with. And so that's what we're going to continue to read as we continue in this chapter of Joshua. Because in verse 2, we see, yes, now Israel safely crosses over the Jordan River and camps at a place called Gilgal, just north of Jericho. And the first thing that Joshua orders is that all males be circumcised. Now, this circumcision ceremony would have included about up to 1 million adult male Israelites. In fact, that place where this ceremony happened was given the nickname Gibeath Haraloth, which means the hill of foreskins. And the reason why this huge ceremony took place was because that this whole new generation, the one that was about to enter into the promised land, had not been circumcised all the time that they were in the wilderness. Why? Well, maybe because the pain or the infections that normally happen with this customary ceremony was something that they were not going to be able to continue to move around with if they did it earlier. But why are they doing it now? So it's the first time that they're about to celebrate Passover in the promised land. I'm sure they celebrated Passover for the 40 or so years that they were wandering in the desert. But now they're about to receive the promise that God had given them. They want to make sure that they are able to present themselves worthy of receiving that promise. Especially the males had to be prepared. And so circumcision had been something that had been ongoing for the Hebrews since the time of Abraham. And it was a sign that they accepted the covenant of Abraham. We read this in the book of Genesis chapter 17, where we read, "Any uncircumcised male who has not been circumcised in the flesh will be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant." And since these Israelite men were about to inherit the promise of the land, that was the core of the Abrahamic covenant, they had to be circumcised. Otherwise, they had no right to participate in receiving the blessings of entering into the promised land. And so this is why it becomes so important right now, and maybe not for the previous 40 years. And with Moses at Mount Sinai, circumcision now also became a sign of the acceptance of the covenant of Moses. So this physical representation was to be able to say, I accept and receive the covenant with Abraham, and I accept and I receive the covenant with Moses. And Joshua had been carefully instructed to be obedient to the law. Now remember, this is the first generation that has scripture. They have Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, and now they're trying to live accordingly. And to be able to ensure that everybody is following all this, they had to show that acceptance, that physical representation, that not just Joshua, but every male in that community had accepted the fact that they were following Torah or following God according to his scriptures. These male Israelites were to be God's holy warriors in this holy war at Canaan. Only those who were under God's covenants were eligible to participate in this battle. No foreigners, no outsiders could be involved. And as we read, the very first verse of this chapter lets us know that basically all of the Canaanites were afraid of Israel coming towards them. They were in a depression. They were scared. And, usually when you see an army coming in to take over your land and you know that they're coming, you might take the offensive early in order to stop them from coming in. That's what you might expect from people in Canaan or even the Amorites. They would have attacked Israel immediately. But somehow God puts a fear in them that they actually do nothing to stop the Israelites. Now, that might seem like an arbitrary thing that God does, but there's something that actually blesses Israel with, and that is, it first of all allows them to cross over the Jordan River unopposed. There's no battle there at the Jordan River. If you're going to stop an army stepping in, you might want to stop them right there at that body of water where they would have to fight the water, the elements of nature, as well as you, and it'd be much harder for them to be able to cross. But as they're crossing, there's no army there, which would have been weird. Why? Because God had put the fear in them not to attack. It also allows them to have the time that they needed to be able to heal from the large circumcision ceremony that they participated in. There's no armies coming towards them. If they did, that would have been the best time to be able to attack them during this time when they were all trying to heal. This was very common knowledge. In fact, the Israelites used that tactic earlier on in the book of Genesis, where males of Shechem were circumcised, and the sons of Jacob decided that they were going to attack and kill all of the men at Shechem due to their weakened condition, the fact that they were healing. Why did they do this? Well, because their sister had been raped. They were upset that their father did nothing about it. And so they tricked them and saying, hey, if you circumcise yourselves, you can be part of our clan. We gladly will accept you. When all the time they knew if they circumcise themselves, they won't be able to fight because of the pain and because of the healing process that they had to go through. That's when we'll attack them. Everybody knows this. And so with the Israelites being circumcised, it was a good thing that the fear of God was in the other nations, that they would not attack them. Otherwise, we run into that similar account that I just told you about in Genesis 34. We read this. All the men who went out to the city gate agreed with Hamor and his son Shechem, and every male in the city was circumcised. 3 days later, while all of them were still in pain, 2 of Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took their swords and attacked the unsuspecting city, killing every male. And so that gives us some idea of what it would have been like to be able to heal from that kind of procedure and how it could be taken advantage of, because it's exactly how 2 men were able to go into a city and kill all the males. It is not something that the Bible approves, but it is a historical context that we can look at and say, that makes sense. It is very practical that they performed this ceremony, the Israelites, as they crossed over the Jordan, because they knew that the fear of God was not going to allow those other cities or those other territories to come attack. They were safe for the moment. And then we get to verses 8 and 9, where, depending on your translation, my translation in NIV, it said the reproach of Egypt, it mentions that, or some other translations may say the stigma of Egypt. That is all referring to the disobedience of the first generation coming out of the Exodus. They were raised in Egypt and they were actually wishing that they could go back. And that's why they didn't get to enter into the promised land. And so this whole idea of the reproach of Egypt or the stigma of Egypt is mentioned in verses 8 and 9. It was something that led to the dying of the first generation that approached the land of Canaan, and it disqualified them from being able to enter into the promised land and to receive God's rest. Now, we know that Egypt is a real and literal place. But a lot of times when we hear about the stigma or the reproach of Egypt, which comes up often in the Bible, talking about Egypt or even something like Babylon, we'll get to eventually, it came to be used in Scripture as a metaphor and an illustration of sin or perversion that the world would take on, and that it was to be removed in order for anyone to be righteous in God's eyes. So when you hear the terms Babylon or Egypt, it's not necessarily talking about the place, but the ideas or the type of culture that it was known for. And it says, if you're acting that way, then you have not submitted to the Lord. I mean, we all think about that. We could think about, oh, well, you know how those Chicagoans are, or how those New Yorkers are, or how, it's the same idea. You know how those Egyptians were, they rejected God. Those Babylonians, wow, they really came after and worshiped idols and did all these horrible things. We don't want to be associated with that name. And that's exactly what it's talking about here, the stigma of Egypt or the reproach of Egypt. Not just the land, but the type of mentality or worship or idolization that was going on there. It was representing the disobedience. And if that disobedience was not removed, the eternal death would then be the result. And so we read about this, how it will be rolled off, or it will be taken away in some way, shape, or form. And the place that it was talking about where this would happen was called Gilgal. Gilgal either means a circle as a noun, or a verb, it could mean to roll away. And so what we're reading about is that this disgrace of Egypt, the disobedience that Egypt represented, would be rolled away from the Israelites. And that's why that place was called Gilgal, because they accept God's commands, and because they accepted it and are living obediently to that, all of that disobedience, all of that stigma would be rolled off. And so they walk forward in obedience to all that God has commanded. And after circumcision, that ceremony, we read that the Passover comes along on the 14th day of that month. Now, again, it always falls on the 14th day of their first month. And they have been doing that ever since Moses received the commandments from Mount Sinai. And they just spent 40 years in the wilderness. And I'm sure they would have celebrated that. So it's possible, it's very likely that they would have crossed over on the 10th day of that first month, which is preparation day. And after they crossed over, maybe on the 11th, 12th, 13th day, who knows, they get some circumcised and they're still able to observe or celebrate the Passover on the 14th day. And then after Passover, the very next day, which is the 15th day of the first month, as always, as it's always been written in the Torah, the very next day after Passover is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And then they would have eaten their bread, they would have eaten all the roasted grain that we read about. And this is the time when they would have offered a wave offering of barley sheaves. We read about this in the Torah in the book of Leviticus. It says, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I am going to give you and you reap its harvest, bring to the priest a sheaf of the first grain you harvest. He is to wave the sheaf before the Lord, so it will be accepted on your behalf. The priest is to wave it on the day after the Sabbath. On the day you wave the sheaf, you must sacrifice as a burnt offering to the Lord a lamb a year old without defect, together with its grain offering of 2/10 of an ephah of the finest flour mixed with olive oil. A food offering presented to the Lord, a pleasing aroma, and its drink offering of 1/4 of a hin of wine. You must not eat any bread or roasted or new grain until the very day you bring this offering to your God. This is to be a lasting ordinance for the generations to come, wherever you live." And it is after that day that the manna stopped, and they actually ate food that was grown in the promised land, instead of the manna that they had eaten for years. Almost their entire lives of wandering in the deserts, now they get to eat from the fruits of the promised land. Not just their diet, but their lives are about to change radically in this new land that God had given them. Now, how does that apply to us? Well, with Christianity, we can kind of see some parallels between crossing over the Jordan River and redemption, right? And Christians, we kind of see this, but sometimes we just don't do it. We don't do exactly what the principles are calling out here, right? We typically go on, we may cross over the river and cross into salvation, right? Cross over into the promise, but we don't stop eating the wandering food that we were wandering with, or the things we used to do, the things that was dull and bland, and the stuff that doesn't bring you nourishment, or the stuff that doesn't bring you pleasure or fulfillment and things like that, because it's just so plain. And here we're walking into this promised land, and all of a sudden it's brand new, and we've got such a variety of things to enjoy, but sometimes we keep going back and just holding on to the stuff that we previously enjoyed. Notice that it was only after circumcision, after crossing the river, and after the Passover that their diet changes and they begin to eat a biblically kosher diet prescribed by the law. Now, eating kosher is not what I'm focusing on here, okay? There could be some advantages to that. There are some people who believe that that is a proper diet, that is the better diet. But let's look at this in this spiritual principle. Eating kosher is not salvation. It's not a way to maintain it. But eating kosher does have a biblical principle to it, in that most people aren't willing to change their diet. We're not willing to change the things that we allow into our lives that would radically change us or radically represent the change that has happened within us. For the most part, it probably doesn't seem like a pleasant thing to do. It doesn't seem like something we want to do. I don't want to stop doing the things I've been doing. I don't want to quit the things that I've been accustomed to, the way I live and the places I go and the people I hang out with. Maybe that doesn't seem pleasant. There are plenty of other things that aren't going to seem pleasant either when it comes to living for God, like giving sacrificially, like taking a bold stand for Christ, like speaking out against evil, like denying ourselves things that we could have, but it'd be a lot better if we didn't have those things anymore. And one of the things is that the modern church today has only concerned itself with two major things: getting saved, getting blessed. That's all we want. I just want to get saved. I just want to get blessed. Without realizing there's so much more to living according to the Bible and living for God than just getting saved, getting blessed. We think that salvation is that God is just going to bless us first and then give us all the stuff that we want. And typically, when we are first born again, we're immature. We are naive. We're not supposed to stay that way, are we? We're supposed to be able to grow, to be able to train ourselves, to be more open to taking on challenges and tasks and even some risks. We're supposed to move from being the takers to the givers, from the ones that we are being cared for to the ones who actually start caring for others. Moving from childhood to being an adult in everyday life is pretty traumatic, right? It's uncomfortable. It's challenging. It's more than we could probably expect as a child growing into an adult. And some people, admittedly so, I mean, just look around. Some people are just not successful in that transition. Some are going to go on their entire lives making decisions like children. They're always going to be seeking more blessings and rarely seeking the opportunity to reach out and bless others. See, we're more comfortable to be able to accept God as a child does, to the point that we actually go to our graves as spiritual toddlers. Now, I know the scriptures say we have a childlike faith, right? But it doesn't say we have a childish faith. Okay, being a childlike faith means, yeah, I depend on him, I rely on him. But don't stay childish in the way you're supposed to grow and mature. You're still a child of God, but now you start taking on the responsibilities and the commands of being his hands and feet reaching out. So it's time that we start saying, hey, I'm getting off of this spiritual milk. I want some of the heavenly meat that you have prepared for me. We have to be able to make that transition. If not, we are being childish with our spirituality. And so the Hebrews, the Israelites, as they cross over, they have to face this challenge as well. They have to start fending for themselves. God is no longer going to be spoon feeding them the manna from heaven. They are going to have to go out there and reap the harvest of the produce at that time. Now, the first time they're there, the produce had been grown by the Canaanites, or the people who lived there. And it wasn't until Israel comes and conquer the land that they would be able to celebrate many other feasts from this point forward, using the grains and the fruits and the vegetables that were produced by themselves and not just by their enemies. Again, they are going to have to take on the responsibility of being in this promised land. And the key was that it's grown in the promised lands, and they were going to be the consumers. So now that Israel is going to start maturing, it's going to be more expected of them to live off what the land produces that God gave them, rather than God just giving them stuff, raining manna from heaven. This God says, I've given you all these things. You work it now. You get out there, you pour out the sweat, you pour out the blood and tears to be able to celebrate the things that I've given you. And this is a step that all believers need to be able to take in our spiritual walk. But it surprises me how desperately we as Christians, we just keep on trying and we keep on looking up and this God just bless me, where he actually wants us to go forward and to claim what's already there and make use of it. And as we're making use of the things that he's given us, we still give him thanks. We still praise him for the fact that, yeah, I have to work now. I have to be able to take on some more responsibilities, but I thank you for the opportunities and the provisions that you've given. So that takes boldness, that takes effort, that takes courage, that takes a lot of more faith and trust than probably we had when we first came into this. We'd rather sit in a chair and just pray for God's blessings rather than get up and get on our feet and do all that he commands us. I mean, how many times do I hear people say, well, I just need to be fed, or I left the church because I wasn't being fed anymore, or things like, well, a maturity has to step in where you need to be able to start feeding yourself and eventually start being able to feed others. This is why we read in the gospel where Jesus confronts Peter as he's about to assign him his task in the Gospel of John, chapter 21. This was now the third time that Yeshua, Jesus, was revealed to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said, you know that I love you. He said, feed my lambs. He said to him again a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Lord, he said, you know that I love you. He said to them, take care of my sheep. He said to him a third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was grieved because he said to him for a third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. See, we're intended to move on from needing to be fed daily to being the ones who feed others. And just like Israel that was preparing for the Passover only hours after entering in the promised land, they had to start to transition from being fed to being able to feed themselves. Now, after celebrating that first Passover, after taking on the responsibility of what a mature believer at that time had to take on, they have to prepare to take on Jericho. That would be their first battle. And as they're preparing, Joshua takes a walk and he looks up and he sees a man standing in front of him with a sword in his hand. And without hesitation, Joshua faces him and asks him a very practical question. Are you for us or are you for our enemy? And the man says that he's neither. He's actually the commander of the Lord's host. Now, this is not a vision. This is not a dream. Joshua is not asleep. This is very real. This is something that is happening right then and there. And what does it mean? Who is this being? Well, whoever it was, he spoke with God's authority. We see that Joshua bows down to him and shows reverence to him. If that is considered worship, if it was an angel, the angel would say, stand up, stop doing that. You are not to worship me. If it's not an angel, if it is a representation, a manifestation of God himself, then he accepts that worship. And here in this passage, we don't see the person standing before Joshua telling him to stop. So now the argument becomes, is he worshiping him or is he just bowing down out of respect for who this person is? Many people think that this is a representation of God himself because we see that he speaks with God's authority. Joshua bows and recognizes that authority and commands are given. And he also tells them to take off his sandals because that place is holy ground. Where else do we see that? In the Torah, in the book of Exodus chapter 3, as Moses approaches the burning bush and he tells to him, come no closer, take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. And so this particular being says that he's the captain or the leader and the commander of God's warrior angels, and he has his sword drawn for battle. And God fulfills his promise of his presence with Joshua. If we remember this in Joshua chapter 1, verses 7 through 9, he says, be very strong and resolute to observe diligently the Torah which Moses, my servant, commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, so that you may be successful wherever you go. This book of the Torah should not depart from your mouth. You are to meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. For then you will make your ways prosperous, and then you will be successful. Have I not commanded you? Be strong. Do not be terrified or dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. This is very similar to what we heard or what we read about later on in the book of Numbers in the Torah with Balaam. In Numbers chapter 22, we read, "When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road with his sword drawn in his hand, the donkey turned off the road and went into the field. So Balaam beat the donkey to get her back onto the road." So God appearing before Joshua was going to be another sign that God is going to be the one responsible for Israel's success. Now, remember their thinking. They are thinking that the gods are the ones who are really in control and decide all of the battles anyway. And so a couple of things we can know about this is that, first of all, this more than likely is God in some shape or form letting Joshua know he is there and he is with him. And the second point is that it's clear that he is the commander of God's host and that he's not come to do battle there on earth. But his message to Joshua is, one, it's spoken, take off your sandals, I'm at holy ground. And the other part is visual. With that the sword drawn, they're about to enter into battle. He is identifying himself as the warrior leader for God's spiritual army. And the Lord is revealing to Joshua that while Joshua is doing battle here on earth, there is another battle occurring and happening right then and there in the heavens. God shows up before Jericho in order to encourage Joshua and to provide directions for Joshua on how they were going to do this. We read that later on in chapter 6, the procedure that they would take on in order to defeat Jericho. And so God is showing Joshua what goes on in heaven is actually connected to what goes on here on earth. And somehow, instinctively, Joshua knows to believe what God is revealing to him because something was different in this being. He had enough authority represented that we read in the very last verse of the book of Joshua that Joshua did so. This is a very simple way to illustrate acting on faith when it is humanly possible. This is a very simple way to show us that acting on faith when it is humanly impossible to understand all of the circumstances going on is possible. We can do this. We can be obedient. We don't have to have all of the answers, but we can have enough evidence. We can have enough understanding to walk forward in faith, and God will continue to reveal more to us as we continue to walk towards Him. And that's the goal of every Christian, every person who believes in God and believes in the Scriptures. We're not going to see it exactly right now, but having faith is being able to have hope for the things that are unseen. We continue to walk forward. We don't have to have it there first. We already have enough that it's not hard to take the next step because God has proven Himself time and time again. And so that's, I believe, where we will stop with Joshua chapter 5. We'll continue on in Joshua chapter 6 next time. But what do you think? How are these principles applied in our lives? Where are we successful? Where are we failing? And when God reveals to us so many different ways, but especially through His Word, are we being obedient to that? Or are we continuing to hold on to the manna that is no longer being provided by God? We liked being spoon-fed, but God says, no, you need to start feeding yourself with the things that I've provided, but you need to start feeding yourself. Have we taken that step? Have we taken it upon ourselves? We have the resources here. Now we need to consume it. And that is mainly through the Scriptures, through the Word that God has given us in His Holy Bible. Read that over and over again, feed from it, grow from it, being able to let it form and shape our lives, because the previous things are now gone away. It's now time to start living a new and fruitful way. So I pray this blesses you. I hope this is something that you can take with you and live out accordingly as we move into the next couple of chapters. So thank you so much for watching. God bless you, and hope to see you next time. God bless.